Hey, welcome back, everybody. This time around, we're going to be reading The Return of the Indian by Lynn Reed Banks. Remember, this is the sequel to The Indian in the Cupboard. And if you guys remember, just a quick recap, in The Indian in the Cupboard, Omri got a special cupboard for his birthday and a special key. Now, once he decided to put one of his toy Indians on the inside, and he locked it with a key and then unlocked it, the Indian came to life. And after that, he learned that his name was Little Bear, and he learned that Little Bear was very bossy as he tried to make Little Bear happy. He also learned that Little Bear was not just a toy come to life, but a real live miniature Indian from a whole nother time. Once he did that, he let his friend Patrick put in a cowboy figure, and he came out, and his name was Boone, and he was a crying cowboy. Now, they went on a lot of different adventures together until finally, Little Bear got mad at Boone and shot him with a bow and arrow. And because of this, Little Bear had to help and get him healed up from his injury. And he also had to find the key that got lost. And it was a whole adventure until finally Boone got better. And Patrick and Omri eventually used the cupboard to make him a wife. And her name was Bright Stars. And now once they did this, Omri decided that it would be a good idea to let Little Bear and Boone go back to their own time. So he said goodbye to them, and he gave the key to the cupboard to his mom for safekeeping. And if you remember, his mother had gotten that key from her grandma, and she said that she would always keep it with her, and it always reminded her of her. So that's it for our little recap of the first book. Hopefully you remember all that, probably remember a whole lot more. So let's start with our first chapter of Return of the Indian. Chapter 1, A Defeat. Omri emerged cautiously from the station into Hoof Road. Someone with a sense of humor and a black spray can had recently added an L to the word Hoove on the street sign on the corner, making it Hovel Road. Omri thought grimly that this was much more appropriate than Hove, which sounded pleasantly like somewhere by the sea. Omri would have liked to live by the sea, or indeed almost anywhere in the world rather than Hovel Road. He had done his best to understand why his parents had decided to move here from the other house in the other, much nicer neighborhood. True, the new house was larger and so was the garden, but the area was actually a slum. Now, guys, slum just means a really bad area, so he couldn't understand why that they had moved somewhere like that. Omri's father objected strongly to Omri calling it a slum, but then he had a car. He didn't have to walk half a mile along Hovel Road to the station every day as Omri did to get to school, and again, as now, to get home in the gloomy afternoon. It was October, and the clocks had gone back. That meant that when he came out of the station, it was practically dark. Omri was only one of many children walking, playing, or hanging around in Hovel Road at this hour, but he was the only one who wore a school uniform. Of course, he took his blazer off and tie off in the train and stuffed them into his school bag, but that still left his white shirt, black trousers, and gray pullover. However, he mussed them up. He still stood out among the others that he had to pass through. These others all went to a local school where a uniform was not required. Under other circumstances, Omri would have begged his parents to let him change schools. At least then he wouldn't have been an obvious outsider. Or maybe he would. He couldn't imagine going to school with these kids. After a term and a half of running the gauntlet of their mindless antagonism every working day, he regarded them as little better than a pack of wolves. That group waiting for him on the corner by the amusement arcade, he knew them by now, and they knew him. They waited for him as if they had nothing better to do. His passing seemed to be one of the highlights of their day. Their faces positively lit up as they saw him approach, and it took all his courage to keep walking towards them. At moments like this, he would remember Little Bear. Little Bear had been only a fraction of Omri's size, and yet he had stood up to him. If he had felt scared, as Omri did now, he never showed it. Omri was not much smaller than these boys. There was just so many of them, and only one of him. But imagine if they'd been giants, as he was to Little Bear. They were nothing but kids like himself, although several years older, except that they weren't like him. "They're rats," he thought, to rouse himself for battle. "Pigs, toads, mad dogs." It would be shameful to let them see that he was afraid of them. He gripped his school bag tightly by both handles and, come on. If only he had Boone's revolver, or Little Bear's knife, or his bow and arrows, or his axe. If only he could fight like a cowboy or an Indian brave. How he would show that crew then. The boy he had to pass first was a skinhead, like several of the others. The cropped head made him look somehow animal-like. He had a flat, whitish face and about 5 gold rings in one ear. Omri should have detoured a bit to be out of range, but he would not swerve from his path. The skinhead's boot shot out, but Omri was expecting that and skipped over it. And then a concentrated movement by the others jerked Omri into evasive action. Speed was his only hope. He broke into a run, hampered by his heavy bag. Several hands reached out to grab him as he passed. Once caught and held fast, he swung the bag, and it hit home. The boy released his hold, doubled over, and said, "Oh!" It reminded Omri of the time Little Bear had fought Boone, the cowboy, and got kicked in the stomach. He'd made some noise. Someone else clutched Omri's flying shirt tail, and he jerked away hard and heard it rip. He swung around with his bag again, missed, found himself turning in a circle after the bag. There was the sound of jeering laughter. He felt hot rage flood under his skin. He was roused now. He wanted to stop, to fight, but he saw their sneering, idiot faces. That was all that they were waiting for. They would beat him up. They'd done it before. And he had stumbled home with a bloody nose and a shoulder bruise from the pavement, and one shoe missing. His school bag, too. He'd had to go back. Adil, the older of his 2 brothers, had gone with him, and found all his books scattered on the bag, torn and half full of garbage. An experience like that taught you something. He fled, hating himself, but hating his enemies worse. They didn't pursue him. That would have been too much trouble. But their shouts and jeers followed him all the way to his gate. As he turned into it, he slowed down. He was on safe ground here. It was a different world. The property had a high hedge which shut it off from the street. The house was a nice house. Omri didn't deny that, but he could see into that warm, well-in living room with its familiar furniture and lamps and ornaments and pictures. His mother was in there, just putting a match to the open fire. Omri paused in the twilight to watch. He loved to see the flames. These 2 reminded him of Little Bear and the tiny fires he had made outside his teepee, the love dance he had done around his fire when he'd married Bright Stars. Omri sighed. It was over a year since that time, but not a single day had passed without his thinking about his Indian and all the astonishing adventures that they'd had together. Omri had grown up quite a bit in the meantime. There had been moments that he almost would have liked to believe that he'd made the whole thing up. A plastic Indian coming alive? Absurd. He had tried to push it to the back of his mind, but it wouldn't be pushed. It was as vividly real to him as if it had happened this morning. The little bathroom cupboard, his special key, which his mother had given him, and magic. The magic that brought plastic people to life. It had happened. All of it. And yet 3 days ago, Patrick behaved in that peculiar way. It had shaken Omri, shaken his belief in his own memory. Patrick, too, had moved out of the old neighborhood. When his parents got divorced, he and his mother and brother had gone right away. This had happened months ago. At first, the boys had written to each other, but somehow the letters had petered out. There had been no contact between them until 3 days ago. Omri had been walking out of the school gate, their old school. Omri was now in his final year before high school, and he found Patrick waiting for him. Patrick had grown. He looked different in the face as well. They just stood in front of each other, grinning, not knowing what to say. "Well, how have you been?" said Patrick at last. "Well, all right," said Omri. "Have you moved back?" "No, we're visiting. I thought I'd come and look at the old school." Well, they had begun walking towards the station. "Well, do you like where you live now?" asked Omri. "Oh, yeah, the country's all right. Once you get used to it. I've made a few friends, and the cottage is nice. Seems funny with just the 3 of us." Omri didn't press this point. He could hardly imagine life without his dad. But then, his dad didn't hit him, or hit his mother. They chatted on rather awkwardly with some silences, but it got better. By the time they had reached the station, it was almost as if Patrick had never gone away, as if they were still as close as they used to be. That was why Omri didn't hesitate to say, "Where do you keep Boone and his horse?" Patrick seemed to stumble as he walked, like a hiccup with his feet. Who? A little cold shiver passed down Omri's back. He stopped. Boone. Patrick stopped too. He stared across Omri's shoulder at the station. What are you on about? What's Boone? Who's Boone? Omri narrowed his eyes. Could Patrick be serious, or was he teasing? But Patrick wasn't a tease. You know perfectly well. You're cowboy. There was a silence. Patrick was rubbing his thumb against the side of his finger, a quick, dry, nervous sound. My little bear was my Indian, said Omri. He couldn't quite believe what seemed to be happening, so he rattled on. I've still got him, of course, the plastic figure of him, I mean. Remember how he sat on his pony with bright stars in front of him, and he raised his hand to say goodbye just as we shut the cupboard door when we sent them back? The silence went on for what seemed like eternity, and then Patrick snapped his head around, and he looked into Omri's face. You're talking a load of rubbish, he said loudly. I gave you a plastic Indian for your birthday. That's all I remember. He looked at his watch. Well, my mom's waiting, he said shortly. Bye, and he ran off. Now, as Omri stood outside his new house in the gathering dark, a possible solution to the troubling and incredible episode came to him. Maybe Patrick doesn't want to remember, he thought. Because a thing like that, well, it makes you different from other people. It's a secret you can never tell. Not if you don't want everyone to think you're crazy. It's lonely having a secret like that, and if Patrick hadn't moved away, if they could have kept talking about it and remembering together, then he'd have never denied it or started trying to pretend that it never happened. That's the end of chapter 1. Next up, it'll be chapter 2, A Victory. All right, guys, welcome back. We are on chapter 2 of Return of the Indian, A Victory. Omri entered the house by the side door, which opened into the kitchen. His black and white cat, Kitsa, was sitting on the drain board. She watched him out of her knowing green eyes as he came to get a drink of water. You're not supposed to be up there, Kits, he said. You know that. She continued to stare at him. He flicked some water on her, but she ignored it. He laughed and stroked her head. He was crazy about her. He loved her independence and disobedience. He helped himself to a hunk of bread, butter, and Primula cheese and walked through into the breakfast room. It was their every meal room, actually. Omri sat down and opened the paper to the cartoon. Kitsa came in, and she jumped not onto his knee, but onto the table, where she lay down the newspaper right over the bit that he was looking at. She was always doing this. She couldn't bear to stop to see people reading. Omri felt tired. It had been a long day. He laid his head on his arm, bringing it level with Kitsa's face, and communed with her, eyeball to eyeball. He felt sleepy and cat-like. When his mother came busting in, it gave him a fright. Oh, Mom, I wish you wouldn't bash about like that. Omri. He looked at her. She had a strange look in her face. Her eyes and mouth were wide open, and she was staring at him as if she'd never seen him before. He sat up straight, his heart beating. What's up? A letter came for you, she said in an odd voice to match her goggle-eyed expression. A letter? For me? Well, who from? I'm afraid I opened it. She came over to him and gave him a long envelope, and it was torn open at the top. It had printing on it as well as his name and address in typing. Omri started at it. It said, Telecom, your communications service. He felt numb inside. It couldn't be. It couldn't be. He didn't touch the letter, which lay on the table beside Kitsa. For once, his mother didn't even seem to notice that she was there. Normally, she chased her off. Why did you open it? Omri asked at last in a croaky voice. Darling, because I didn't look at the name. You boys don't get many letters. She gave a short, rather hysterical laugh. Omri quite saw how it could happen. He wished that he could have been the first to know. Well, go on, read it. He picked up the envelope and took out the letter. Dear Omri, we are delighted to inform you that your story, The Plastic Indian, has won first prize for your age group in our Telecom Creative Writing Competition. We think it is a superb story showing extraordinary powers of imagination and invention. All judges consider it worthy of publication. Your prize, £300, will be presented to you at a party we are giving for all prize winners on November 25th in the Savoy Hotel. A special invitation card will be sent to you. May we congratulate you on your success. Yours sincerely, Squiggle Squiggle, Competition Director for Telecom. Omri kept his eyes on the letters long after he had finished reading it. Inside, he was jumping up from his chair, running around and around the room, hugging his mother, shouting with triumph. But in reality, he just sat there, staring at the letter. A deep glow, like hot coals on his chest, too, happy and astonished to move or speak. He didn't even notice that his free hand was stroking Kitsa from nose tip to tail again and again while she lay on the newspaper, purring with bliss. His mother woke him from his trance. "Darling, do you realize, isn't it fantastic? And you never said a single word." At this moment, his father came in from outdoors. He'd been working in the garden, as often he did, until it was actually too dark to see, and now he stamped the mud off his shoes in the open doorway. But for once, Omri's mother didn't care about the mud, and fairly dragged him into the room. "Oh, do come and hear the news. I've been bursting to tell you all day. Omri, tell him. Wordlessly, Omri handed his father the letter. There was a silence. Then his father breathed reverently. "God in heaven, £300! "Well, it's not the money," cried his mother. Look what they say about his story. He must be brilliant, and we never even knew he had a writing talent." She came to Omri and smothered him with hugs. "When can we read it? Oh, just wait till the boys hear about this." His brothers, yes, that would be almost the sweetest thing of all. They always behaved as if he were too thick to do anything, and telling him that at school his English teacher simply wouldn't believe her senses. Perhaps Mr. Johnson, the headmaster, would get him up at assembly and announce the news, and they would all applaud, and he would be asked to read the story aloud. Omri's head began to spin with incredible excitement of it. He jumped up. "I'll go and get my copy, and you can read it," he said. "Oh, did you keep a copy?" "Yes, that was in the rules." He stopped in the doorway and returned. "I typed it on your typewriter when you were out," he confessed. "Did you indeed? Well, that must have been the time that I found all the keys jumbled together." But she wasn't a bit annoyed. "And I borrowed paper and carbon paper from Dad's desk and a big envelope to send it in." His mother and father looked at each other. They were both absolutely beaming with pride, as they had been when Gillen had come home and announced that he'd broken a swimming record at school, and when Adil had passed 10 O-level exams. Omri, looking at them, knew suddenly that he had never expected them to have that look because of him. "Well," said his father, very solemnly, "now you can pay me back. That will be 11.5 pence you owe me." His face broke into a great soppy grin. Omri raced upstairs, and his heart was pounding. He had won. He'd actually won. He'd never dared to hope that he would. Of course, he dreamed a bit. After all, he had tried his very best. And it was a great story to begin with. Imagination and invention, eh? That was all they knew. The real work was in the way he'd written it, and rewritten it, and checked the spelling until, just for once, he could be confident that every word was right. He'd gotten Adil to help with that part, without telling him, of course, what it was actually for. "Stirrup, maize, Iroquois." "Iroquois," Adil had exclaimed. "It's the name of an Indian tribe," said Omri. Fancy not knowing that. Omri had now read so many books about American Indians that he'd forgotten that not everyone was as knowledgeable on the subject as himself. "Well, I haven't a clue how to spell it. Irokw. No, it's not. It's like French. Well, never mind. I know that one. I just wanted to see if you did. Whiskey?" Adil spelt it, and then asked, "What on earth is this you're writing? What a weird bunch of words." "Well, it's a story, and I've got to get it as good as I can." "But what's it about? Let me see it," said Adil, making a grab at the notebook. Omri dodged. "Leave off. I'll show you when it's finished. Now, bandage." Adil spelt this. Actually, Omri had it right. And then Omri hesitated before saying, "Cupboard." Adil's eyes narrowed. You're not telling about the time I hid your so-called secret cupboard after you nicked me football shorts. Well, I didn't. The time the key got lost and you made such an idiotic uproar, you're not going to put me into any stupid school story. Well, I'm changing the names, said Omri. Well, you'd better. Any more words? Omri read on silently to the next longish word. Magnanimous. Wow, said Adil with heavy sarcasm. Bet you don't even know what it means. Yes, I do. It means generous. Well, where'd you get it from? The Iroquois were a tribe ferocious in war, stalwart in alliance, magnanimous in victory, quoted Omri. You sound like Winston Churchill, said Adil, but there was a trace of admiration in his voice at the time. Guys, if you don't know who Winston Churchill is, he was sort of like the president of Great Britain during World War II, but they called that person the prime minister, and that's still what they call that person today, the prime minister of Great Britain. Don't make it too show-offy, will ya? You only lose marks if your teacher thinks you've copied it. I haven't written that, you jerk, said Omri. I'm just remembering what I've read in a book. He was beginning to relish long words, though. Later, he went through his story yet again to make sure he hadn't used too many. His teacher was forever saying, "Keep it simple. Stick to what you know." Little would anyone guess how closely that he had stuck to the truth this time. And now, imagination and invention. He paused on the stairs. Had he cheated? It was supposed to be a made-up story. It said so in the rules. Or had it? Creative writing meant that, didn't it? You couldn't create something that had really happened. All you could do was find the best way of writing it down. Of course, he had to make up bits of it. Vivid as his memory of Little Bear and Boone were, he couldn't remember every word they spoke. Omri frowned. He didn't feel entirely easy in his mind. But on the other hand, nobody had helped him. The way he'd written the story was all his own. Maybe it was okay. There wasn't much he could do about it anyhow. He continued more slowly up the stairs to his own room at the very top of the house. So guys, that was it for Chapter 2. Next we'll be going on to Chapter 3, The Way It Began. Chapter 3, The Way It Began. Omri was rather a private person. At least, he needed to be alone quite a bit of the time. So his room, which was right up under the eaves of the house, was perfect for him. In the old house, his bedroom had been just one of several openings of the upstairs landing, and at certain times of the day had been like a railway station. His new room was off the beaten track. No one, in his opinion, had any reason to come up here, or even pass the door. There were times now that he had it all arranged to suit himself, when he forgot about how awful it was living in Hovel Road, when it seemed worth anything to have a room like this. It wasn't a very large room, so his father had built a shelf high up under the skylight for him to sleep on. This was great because he could look up at the night sky. Under this bed shelf were his desk and more shelves for his collection of old bottles, key rings, and wooden animals. The wall opposite the window was covered with his posters, a mixture of old and new, from Snoopy and an early Beatles to the Police, and a funny one about a flasher who gets caught in an elevator. In pride of place were 2 large photographs of Iroquois chieftains that he'd found in magazines. Neither of these Indians looked remotely like Little Bear, but they appealed to Omri just the same. His clothes were stored on the landing, so his room wasn't cluttered up with them. That left quite a lot of space for his beanbag seats, a low table that he'd sawed its legs to half their length after seeing a photo of a Japanese room, his cassette radio, and his most recent acquisition, an old chest. He'd found this in the local market, coated with dirt and grease. He bought it for £2 after bargaining, and borrowed a cart from a market man to drag it around the corner to Hovel Road. He'd cleaned it with a scraper and some sandpaper out in the garden before hauling it up to his room. It had come up a treat, just as the man in the market had promised. The wood was oak, the hinges iron, and it had a brass plate on it, with the name of its first owner. Omri had hardly been able to believe it when he had removed the layers of dirt from this plate and read the name for the first time. It was L. Bear. L. Bear. Little Bear, of course. It was pure coincidence, but, as Omri thought, if I were superstitious, he shined the brass every week, Somehow, it too made him feel closer to Little Bear. The chest was not only interesting and beautiful, but useful. Omri used it for storage. There was only one thing wrong with it. It had a lock, but no key. So he piled cushions and other objects on it and pretended it was a bench. That way, nobody who happened to be prying about in his room, it still happened occasionally, mothers cleaning and brothers poking about borrowing, would realize that it contained a number of interesting and private objects. Omri knelt by the chest now and shifted to the floor a pile of cassettes, a bull-worker. He was bent on developing his muscles, some cushions, and 3 copies of Mad Magazine, among other bits of junk. Then he opened the lid of the chest. It, too, was untidy, but Omri knew where to burrow. On their way down the left-hand side in search of the folder containing his prize-winning story, Omri's fingers touched metal and paused, and then carefully he moved some other things which were in the way, and eased this metal object out. It was a small white cabinet with a mirror in its door and a keyhole, an old-fashioned bathroom medicine cupboard, in fact. He stood it on the Japanese table. The door swung open. Apart from a single shelf, it was quite empty as it had been when he'd first received it, a rather odd birthday present from Gillen just over a year ago. Omri sat back on his heels, staring at it. How clearly it all came back. The cupboard, the strange little key, which had been his great-grandmother's, and which had mysteriously fitted the commonplace lock and turned this ordinary little metal box into a time machine with a difference. Put any plastic object, an axe, an Indian teepee, a quiver of arrows into it, close the door, turn the key, and those things became real. Miniature, but real. Real leather, real cloth, real steel. Put the plastic figures of human beings or animals inside, and in the time it took to lock them in, they too became real and alive, and not just living toys, but people from another time, from their own lives with their own personalities and needs and demands. Oh, it hadn't all been fun and games, as Omri had naively expected at first. Little Bear was no toy, to submit tamely to being played with. He was, for all his tiny stature, a ferocious savage, warlike, and domineering. Omri had soon realized that if any grown-ups found out about the cabinet's magic properties, they would take it, and the Indian and everything else, away. So Omri had to keep it secret, and look after, feed, and protect his Indian as best he could. And when Patrick had found out the secret and sneaked a Texas cowboy into the cupboard so that he too could have a little person, the trouble really started. Little Bear and Boone were natural enemies. They came close to killing each other several times. Even their respective ponies had caused endless difficulties. And then a deal had taken the cupboard one day. The key had fallen out of the lock and been lost, and Omri, Patrick, and the 2 little men had been faced with the dire possibility that the magic was dead, that these minute and helpless people would have to remain in Omri's time, his giant world, and in his care forever. It was this, the terrible fright that they had all had from this notion, that had finally proved to Omri that he would have to give up his Indian friend. For friends, they were by then, of a sort, and send the little people back to their own time, through the magic of the cupboard. When the key was found, that's what they all agreed on. But it was so hard to part that Boone, who was shamingly soft-hearted for a cowboy, had cried openly, and even the boy's eyes were wet. Omri seldom let himself think of those last moments. They upset him so much. When they reopened the cupboard door, there were 2 groups, Little Bear and the wife Omri had found him, Bright Stars, sitting on Little Bear's pony, and Boo-Hoo Boone on his white horse. Only now they were plastic again. Patrick had taken Boone and put him in his pocket, and Omri had kept the Indians. He had them still. He had packed them in a little wooden box which he kept safely at the very bottom of the chest. Actually, it was a box within a box within a box. Each was tied lightly with string. There was a reason for all this. Omri had wanted to make them difficult to get at. He had always known that he would be tempted to put Little Bear and Bright Stars in the cupboard again and bring them back to life. His curiosity about how they were getting on, that alone tormented him every day. They had lived in a dangerous time. Times of war between tribes, wars aided and encouraged by Frenchmen and Englishmen who were fighting on American soil in those far-off days. Boone's time, the time of the pioneering of Texas, 100 years after Little Bear's era was dangerous too. And there'd been another little man, Tommy the British medical orderly from the First World War. They'd magicked him to life to help him when Little Bear was kicked by his horse. When Boone was dying of an arrow wound, Tommy might, just might, still be alive in Omri's world, but he would be terribly old and about 90 by now. By putting their plastic figures into the magic cupboard, by turning the magic key, Omri had the power to recall them to life, to youth. He could snatch them from the past. The whole business nearly blew Omri's mind every time he thought at all deeply about it, so he tried not to think about it too much, and to prevent his yielding to temptation, he had given his mother the key. She wore it around her neck on a chain. It was quite decorative. People often asked her about it, and she would say, "It's Omri's really, but he lent it to me." That wasn't the whole truth. Omri had pressed it on her and begged her to keep it safe for him, safe, not just from getting lost again, but safe from him, from his longing to use it again, to reactivate the magic, to bring back his friends, to bring back the time when he had been not happiest, but most intensely, dangerously alive himself. All right, guys, that's it for the week. And next week we'll start on Chapter 4, The Sweet Taste of Triumph.